Republic of China, I would give them some military aid, but in general, I would cut it back. That is, I think that the exception should be to give them military aid. Sometimes the pressure to give it is from American manufacturers because they think, and we're told, well, if we can give some of that away, it'll make it cheaper back here. So there are some places where I would continue it, but I do think, for instance, in Latin America, I do not understand. I cannot remember the last time a Latin American country fought a war. Somebody here, the Argentines did obviously briefly over the Falklands/Malvinas, but I can't remember the last time there was a war fought, other than a civil war, by a Latin American country, and we have given them large amounts of weapons. We generally have given them weapons because they are worried about each other. So that would be an example of where I believe we could substantially reduce the weaponry. One other place where I think I would probably continue it is India. India is very important. India has been an example of how a democracy can progress economically. For too long, we had the example of China progressing economically with repression, and India, a great democracy, not doing nearly as well. But even there, I think we could probably try to reduce aid to both India and Pakistan rather than give both of it up. Make an exception for the Egyptian-Israeli situation and Taiwan, but otherwise, in general, I agree with you.
I heard that the military itself has suggested some expenses which are not necessary, but that they have not been cut out. I believe one of them was keeping troops in Germany still, or other things. Could you
So
out
you're
on
right. There
this?
have been efforts, but Congress has this record of forcing spending on the Pentagon it doesn't want. Not in that case. Actually, we finally got, I guess there were 2/3 of the troops in Germany are finally coming home. I think they all should come. The pressure comes, there were two kinds of pressure. One, to keep bases open that aren't needed, but even more weapon systems. Look, we had that here, and I will confess, we had a congressional effort to force the Pentagon to buy 2 engines for the plane, and there was great pressure on us to support it because the second engine was going to be built by General Electric. Now, I will confess, by the way, in case you've followed, the first time that came up, I voted for the unnecessary second engine, and the reason I did it is not that they build them in Massachusetts. Financial Services Committee, who represented the area in Ohio. The jet engine group of General Electric is split between Lynn and Evendale, Ohio, near Cincinnati. And it was very important for him. He had a tough district. He was voting with me against the financial industry. He voted for the Independent Consumer Bureau. He voted to regulate derivatives, and he was in trouble. She's nodding her head. She knows the drill. I'm the chairman of his committee. He needed me, so I voted for an unnecessary engine. Fortunately, that was not conclusive. Unfortunately, he lost the 2010 election, and I figured, well, the hell with them if they're ungrateful. So I voted against it the second time around. I was under no compulsion to do it. But yes, there were Congress vote for that. I got to give credit, by the way, to John Boehner, with whom I obviously disagree a lot. He represents an area of Ohio which is also close to where those factories were. And even though he supported the second engine, he did not put a lot of muscle in there to stop it. But there are other cases where Congress has voted not to do that. Now, that's diminishing. I mean, this zero-sum pressure, this deficit reduction, that's affecting that as well. But yes, there are cases of Congress giving the Pentagon weapon systems it didn't want because of the job impact at home.
How substantial is that?
I think it's considerably less than maybe, well, I would guess low single-digit percentages. I mean, with the trouble with the Pentagon, of course, everything's a lot of money, and it is diminishing. I think it may have been probably in the low double digits for a while. I'm talking about billions now. No number lower than that appears in any Pentagon document. But that's diminishing substantially because of this, of the budget pressures. And Congress did, to its credit, Pat Schroeder was one of the ones who did this, former Congressman Pat Schroeder. They came up with something called the Base Realignment Commission, BRAC. And it was a situation where Congress gave a commission the power to close military bases without any further congressional vote. And they did that, and it worked well. I thought it was a good thing. There was some talk about a second BRAC, but by the way, that's now leading even a number of Republicans to say, okay, well, before we do a second closure of bases in America, what about the rest of the world? And I think we are going to see some of that pressure come forward. Yeah.
You said that the U.S. should not be painting fences for the other countries, particularly in Europe, where there's no longer a Cold War threat. Do you have a firm position on NATO?
Yes, I think we should, one, continue to celebrate NATO as one of the great accomplishments in history. Two, recognize that the circumstances in which it was created have gone, and it was a very long time ago. If you project backwards, I do this sometimes. I look back from a certain date. All right, let's do that. For instance, I've spoken at a couple of colleges this year, and I realized for me to speak at a college today would be like someone speaking when I was a freshman about the events of Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, you go back in time the same amount. Or when I first started working in Boston, it was 1967. It would be like encountering someone who had first started working in politics under the presidency of Warren Harding. So that's one of the facts I take into account. Well, if you go back in time from NATO's founding, as far as we are from that time, you are in the first administration of President Grover Cleveland. Very few other public policies have survived from the first Cleveland administration. Remember, he was president twice with a break in the middle. I would treat NATO as a purely sort of political confab, and essentially, I think calling it a military alliance it's a trap for us to spend more money than anybody else. And part of the problem is this, by the way, we made this great mistake under John Foster Dulles. The French were ready to start a European military, and we have resisted that. I think we ought to promote that. But the second choice is I leave NATO as it is, but announce that America is going to follow the model of Libya, in which the Europeans did the fighting, although the Europeans weren't able to do a great deal without a lot of American equipment. But I would essentially say NATO as a military effort should be substantially depleted. I probably dismantling it would be unnecessarily disruptive. We ought to severely limit what we do with regard to NATO and recognize it as more of a political than a military alliance. It is really not a military alliance anymore in the sense of any broad participation.
Given the current abysmal state of unemployment in the country and the scientific evidence about climate change, what work is being done I suppose, from the mass delegation to Congress and the Senate about sustainable jobs in alternative energy?
Yeah, it's a good question.
To
First
make
of all,
up for budget, for job loss
Yeah.
when military bases, etc.,
Well,
and
first of all-
weapons factories are closed.
First of all, when we talk about reducing military spending, we are not talking about firing any member of the military before his or her term. People in the military, I think the average term is something like 6 years, which means an awful lot leave every year. You can get a substantial manpower reduction simply by attrition. You do not have to lay anybody off, and we wouldn't be suggesting that. As to sustainable jobs, and by the way, one other thing about climate change, reducing some of the military, you talk about the consumption of fuel. I mean, all the jets practicing, all the ships. I mean, keeping unnecessary, very heavy, very sophisticated weaponry out there all the time is a major fuel consumer. But finally, the Massachusetts delegation is in the lead on that. In particular, Ed Markey, for example, has been the chair under Nancy Pelosi of our sustainable thing. Our problem is that the Republicans are opposed to it. So we have been frustrated in the House. But the Massachusetts Democratic delegation in particular has been very active, and Senator Brown somewhat here, but particularly Senator Kerry, Congressman Markey, and a number of others, in trying to provide various forms of funding. Well, we do it two ways. First, by providing funding for alternative energy and subsidies. Second, by tax reductions, tax credits in some cases. And third, by some mandates, by mandating certain targets. So we are working very hard on trying to do all that. Part of the problem, I have to say, and we have to deal with the Chinese situation. The Chinese have been very heavily subsidizing their own alternative energy industry to the point where it undercuts ours. I was in New Bedford a couple of weeks ago touring some businesses. And the first two businesses I went to in the New Bedford Industrial Park, which are in the alternative energy field, both volunteered, uncoordinated, complaints about Chinese government subsidized competition, which is making it hard for them to stay in business. So we are talking about trying to fight back against the Chinese if we do this. Not that we're not talking about American protection here. We're talking about rejecting Chinese subsidies that make it impossible for Americans to compete. But there are a whole range of areas where we have been supportive of developing alternative energy. I will say, I mentioned New Bedford. People here may have had different views. I regard the decision to go ahead with Cape Wind as a very good one. And there is a kind of a node developing in southeastern Massachusetts on wind power. They've got a place in Fall River to build some big turbines. And in New Bedford, which is a city which has high unemployment, we are going to be constructing a assembly plant for Cape Wind. That is, the windmills are going to be assembled on the New Bedford waterfront. Governor Patrick has been very helpful with the state on that. So yeah, we are very engaged in that.
Next question is over here.
Yeah.
Yeah. How would you get people to come out and vote? Because there's a lot of people don't vote. I mean, that may be a little bit off the point here, but
No, it's very much a point. I don't know how. Obviously, I've been trying as hard as I can for 40 years. I guess the one thing you can do is, well, I would say this. There's something people can.
Of cutting military spending.
Let me. Yes. Actually, I kind of plan to run my mouth for money. To be honest, I will not be lobbying. Oh, you're just saying that because you're a politician. Well, I'm going to talk about what I think is the immorality of reducing the cost of living for 82-year-old women who are living on a fairly small amount of money in Social Security without people.